Hello, everyone. I'm Shiv. I'm double majoring in economics and business, and this project was a hope of mine since high school to have something that I could study in my home country of Kenya, and I got to bring it to life through KHC and through the economics department in CAS, under which this is also a thesis. So my title is Colorful Chaos, an examination of factors influencing the economic performance of matatus in Kenya. I'll give you a little bit of background. This is Kenya. You guys know what Africa looks like, but not everyone knows where Kenya is. That one in red, which is why it's in red, so you can see it. Kenya is a really cool country, and Nairobi is the capital of Kenya. Nairobi is the city where I have lived for the last 10 years. Gorgeous city, as you can see in the picture above. The picture below is also really cool and very real. That's the national park that borders Nairobi that has lots of animals. These animals sometimes come into the city and cause traffic jams, but what causes worse traffic jams is actually the public transport within the city. And they're called matatus, which is the subject of this paper. They're often 16 to 18-seater colorful vans like the one in this picture, but sometimes they're not, like the one in that picture I took. That's me driving. I was stuck in traffic for 45 minutes because of 8 matatus that had piled into one intersection, and they had essentially caused a traffic jam because matatus like drive around very quickly and go around and basically try to get from point A to point B as fast. But if there's like 50 of them trying to get to the same point, it's going to cause a problem. And the problem is because there's no real system for matatus. They're owned by savings cooperatives called Saccos, which are all private, and yet it's public transport. The government has nothing to do with them. The government doesn't regulate them because Kenya's government's lazy. And they often sort of are in constant competition with each other. And this is kind of weird because they do contribute almost 45% of the GDP directly or indirectly because people use matatus to go, especially the lower income classes in Kenya use the matatus to get from point A to point B, from rural to urban centers and stuff like that. And it's important for them to get from point A to point B in order to do their jobs. And each Sacco thus helps bring people everywhere. And something interesting is that each Sacco is owned by a very distinct person, and each person has their own levels of education or their own managerial experience and stuff like that. So I sort of made it my job to study into the system, and I found out that there's a pretty big problem there. 10 to 15% of Saccos go bankrupt every year. That may not sound like a problem, but it is. Picture it as though like if you have 10 friends at the start of college, and every year you lose one dropping out. And it's not good, right? And except this is people's livelihoods now. So it becomes a pretty big problem over time as entrepreneurs who are trying to get their jobs going start to fail out one by one, and this really is just a problem that I wanted to try and understand a little bit better. So I decided to figure out what owners want to improve on. And I came on these 2 questions as what I'd like to answer. What are the major factors that determine and drive the performance of the matatu industry in Kenya? And to what extent does each factor actually play a role in the economic success of the firm? In order to answer these questions, I went home to Kenya on KHC's money, so thank you very much. I had a great time in Kenya going around the country, but I also took the time to do work and stuff, and while I was doing the work and stuff, I came up with the model for my paper, and my model is essentially these variables of government policy, entrepreneurial traits, human capital, and the barriers to entry, and how they influence the business success of the matatu industry itself. Business success being basically revenues, because I'm trying to see an economic success rather than sort of what the owner sees as themselves as successful. I just want to see whether or not they make money. And so I ran regressions by collecting a lot of data through a lot of surveys from these matatu owners. And first, I ran a regression on the entrepreneurial traits of these people. These traits included being risk-taking, being self-confident, their market knowledge, and creativity. I asked them to score themselves on a scale of 1 to 5 on where they thought they felt. This is off 120 samples. Found a mean of 4.3 for risk-taking nature. Self-confidence was fairly high. Market knowledge was pretty low, and creativity was on the lower side. After running a regression, I found that risk-taking and self-confidence were both statistically insignificant. For those of you that may be confused what that means, it means I don't think I had enough samples to be able to make a judgment on that, so I ignored them, and I stuck with market knowledge and creativity. I found that for every 1% increase in market knowledge, they can expect to see a 0.63% increase in their revenues. And for every 1% increase in creativity, they can see a 0.27% increase in revenues. And this is cool because this basically means that in order for someone to be successful within the industry, they need to, one, learn the market really well, and two, differentiate themselves. Kenyan said that they prefer certain matatus just because they have certain choices of music or painting, and this is not something that the matatu owners know because there's no system to tell them that, and they're not very well educated, and they don't come from backgrounds where they have access to this kind of information. So they need to know what's going on in Kenya, and they need to make sure that their matatu stands out in order to be more successful. Then I looked at the actual owners themselves too, with their levels of education, their managerial experience, and their experience in the industry. I found that level of education, unfortunately, was not significant, and that was the one I actually wanted to learn about the most. Told me nothing, but it's fine. Managerial experience and industry experience, I found that for every 1% increase, it goes up by 0.15% or 0.67%. And this means that in order to be successful in this industry, you do need managerial experience. If you come in knowing what you're doing, you're most likely going to be a lot more successful, rather than in most entrepreneurial cases when it's a first-time entrepreneur going in and they find themselves successful. Here, it's also really important to study the industry. It's almost 4 times as more important than being a manager is to actually understand what you're doing and what the industry is. And that's what I hope all future matatu entrants will be able to do, is understand what the market is. Why do people choose to go on the matatus? Why do they choose to go from point A to point B in their vehicles? Barriers to entry, which was the cost of matatus and the level of regulation. I found that the cost of matatus was really just not worth analyzing because the mean was 3 and the average of 1 to 5 is 3. And there was almost no standard deviation, so I just completely chose to ignore that. The level of systematic regulation is how many unions there are. And I found that as the number of unions increases by every %, the profits of the industry go down by 0.14%, which means more systemization is horrible for the matatu industry. And for this, I really encourage these people that I spoke to try and push for regulation reform, try and find new ways to unionize, because the way it was set up in that moment was really not good for the industry. It actually caused losses and bankruptcy rather than its intended purpose of saving people. Finally, was looking at the government. Kenya's government has a lot of bureaucratic problems, corruption being the biggest one, and second is the speed at which they work. Recently, the government has tried entering the matatu industry to work with the matatu owners, but for every % increase I found in government involvement, there has been a 0.05% decrease in revenue. And that means if the government chooses to get completely involved, there will be a 5% drop of revenues to the industry as a whole. And that's not a good thing either, because that means that these entrepreneurs who go by on the shilling, which is a cent, on the day, and it's their bare living and necessity. And if the government chooses to get involved, it's actually just going to make them go almost bankrupt. Which is why I decided to talk to all these matatu owners together, the ones that I interviewed and surveyed, and told them about my results. I told them that they need to learn how to manage people. They need to learn the industry that they're in. They need to be more risk-taking. They need to be more self-confident. They need to understand what's going on, but at the same time, they need to be wary of systems and institutions, which is the way the industry has been trending recently, is towards systemization. Because at the end of the day, to be an entrepreneur in Kenya is very difficult. I found that the government has taken no steps to increase the ease of business. Kenya's 80th in the world as far as ease of business goes. The government also needs to increase access to financial credit through microfinance, the way it's worked in India and Bangladesh. And the problem of ride sharing has recently started coming up in Kenya. Uber just entered the market, and it has taken away a significant amount of revenue from these people. And that means they're most likely hurling towards bankruptcy again. And which is why I came up with this study to try and understand what really could cause the problems. And I thus advised these people that I worked with as to what some steps they should be taking. I just completed my thesis last week. I'm defending it next week for the economics department. And after it's defended, I think I'm going to try and get it published by the Matatu Union itself and get it spread to the different Matatu owners, because hopefully, as long as they're able to read through that and understand even the basic gist of it, it'll be good for them. Couple limitations though. Time. I only got to spend a month in Kenya, and it wasn't enough, honestly. One, because I had a great time there and I'd like to go back there and spend more time. But two, because it's really hard to get a reach of these people. Most of them don't want to work with a college student. The scope was another problem. I only could operate in Nairobi because I didn't want to go to rural parts of Kenya and talk to people and come back because I just didn't have the time for that. The budget was another issue because a lot of these people demanded payment and I couldn't afford to pay them. So I had to beg and say that I'm a college student, but that didn't mean much to them. Language is another barrier. Most of them didn't understand what my survey was, and I'm not great at Kiswahili, so Google Translate was my friend for a lot of it. Accuracy was another problem. I just don't know whether or not these people were honest with me. There is no systemized regulation that tells you how much money they're earning or how educated they are. Everything that I found out and everything I analyzed was through their own numbers. So for all I know, they could have been inflating their numbers and lying to me, but I hope they weren't because otherwise that would toss my paper out. And finally, there was a complete lack of prior knowledge. There is no work in this industry because it's not systemized, because it's not regulated. And that really did make things difficult for me, was that I was entering a place and trying to make my own data and research, and it was just sometimes complicated. But I'm happy that I got all the things that I wanted out of it. I was able to complete a dream of mine since high school, to understand an economic industry within my home country. And I want to thank Kelchan for obviously helping me through the last 4 years to figure out the way to do this. Thank you all for coming and listening to something that you may never be impacted by, but I appreciate you coming out to support me and learning more about Kenya. Cool. Fire away.
Considering the future of this transportation industry with the rise of ride sharing. A lot of times internationally, ride sharing is seen as kind of a luxury service, and that can be propelled by certain regulations and requirements by policy. We say policy is slow to move. Does the Kenyan government have any of these policies in place that would regulate ride sharing?
It doesn't, and that was one of my recommendations, was that I want them to bring in regulations to raise costs or to limit the routes in which ride sharing can go. The cost of an Uber in Kenya is really, really low compared to, it's like $1 to go like 20 or 30 minutes, right? But at the same time, a matatu for the same distance would be 20 cents. And that's what's more affordable to people. But there are some matatu riders that are like, the matatu is too hectic, too unsafe, too irregular. Maybe I can just call an Uber, I'll spend like quadruple the amount, but I'll get from my one place to the other. But not everyone in the industry is gonna do that because they can't afford to. A lot of them don't have smartphones and stuff like that. But it is a problem that I really hope the government tries to tackle as soon as possible, because once Uber establishes a monopoly in Kenya by bouncing out the other ride-sharing companies, they're going to start dropping prices. Once they start dropping prices, they're going to essentially gouge out the profits from the matatu industry. Once they do that, 5,000 people will be out of a job. Once 5,000 people are out of a job, they will be adding a burden onto the economy. Once they're adding that burden onto the economy, they will not be able to feed for their families. There will be suffering, and it's a systematic failure going on. And Uber could very much cause that. But that's not the point of my paper. I'm not anti-Uber. I'm just saying this is something that could happen. Yes.
Just from kind of like a sociological perspective, I don't know if you know, but how does a Sacco manager come to be? Like how, I know even that's unregulated, so how does someone go from not being involved in the matatu industry to owning a line of matatu?
Which is one of the things I wanted to, which is one of the things I actually discussed a lot in my thesis, is how to get people into the industry through managerial and industrial experience. They usually start off as drivers in some cases, and then they make matatu drivers, and then they make a little bit of money and they save it, and they're like, let me ask my boss if he's willing to give me some money so I can have my own van, and then he gets a van. In some cases, there are people from privilege. A lot of Sacco owners are very, very wealthy, especially the ones that are in the top 20, 30%, the ones that aren't going bankrupt every year. They're like Kenyan millionaires, which would be like tens of thousands of dollars of net income and net worth, which is like very, very good. And that's another problem, is that since people don't know how to do right, the ones that are doing well will continue to do well. And that is such a systematic problem that exists in so many different industries, but especially in the matatu industry, where the people that are doing well are just going to continue to do well, and then they're going to make more money, and then they're going to drive out the people that want to be entrepreneurs or have to be entrepreneurs to get by. And it's something that I think the Sacco owners would want to think about more. But in order to become one, really, it's you have the money, you buy a van, you tell people to get in your van, and you earn money off it. Yeah. Yes.
How receptive were the matatu owners to the suggestions you made?
It was a very wide range of reception. I would say it went from most of them ignoring me to the ones who actually responded. They said That's cool. And I'm positive they're not following up on that. And then there were actually 4 of the Saccos that I contacted have asked me if I can make a booklet sort of form for them that they can keep and learn a little bit more about. And they want like these statistics and numbers. So I will provide it to them. At some point, I'm also just going to give them my thesis. I don't know if they want to read through 60 or 70 pages of academic nonsense. But yeah, it's going to be something that I hope if a few of them take to heart, then they can spread it to their friends. And if they spread it to their friends, it'll keep going on. But it's a difficult industry. Some of them are really, really stubborn about like, oh, I know what I'm doing. You're just a college student. Like, you don't have the right to tell me. And some of them accepted it pretty well. Cool. All right, Professor Preston, I guess.
That's great.
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah.
So glad we could send you to Kenya too.
Yeah, I was happy.
But actually, I'm really curious. At the very beginning, you said this is public transportation, and that
Yes.
baffles my understanding of public transportation.
Yeah.
So, why classify this as public?
So it is public because the public uses it, and Kenya doesn't have anything else. Kenya doesn't have trains. We don't have buses. I mean, we have buses, but those are also privately owned. We don't have like private taxis or anything like that. This has sort of been grandfathered in and accepted as the country's like public transport system since independence. They started coming up and people started driving vans around, and it's basically just what they do. The only problem is that it's all completely privately owned, and it's a weird concept to grasp around, especially for people here where public transport is public. There's public transport for namesake because it takes the public from one place to another, but it's private transport economically, socially, politically. Cool. Thank you very much.